This is Robert Lee Brewer, and I'm here with poet Jeannine Hall Gailey to discuss, among other things, world building and poetry. Jeannine Hall Gailey is a poet with MS who served as the second poet laureate of Redmond, Washington. She's the author of 6 books of poetry: Becoming the Villainess, She Returns to the Floating World, Unexplained Fevers, The Robot Scientist's Daughter, Field Guide to the End of the World, winner of the Moon City Press Book Prize, and the SFPA's Elgin Award. She has a book upcoming in 2023, Flare Corona, from Boa Editions. She's also the author of PR for Poets, a nonfiction guide to help poets publicize their books. Her work has been featured on the Writer's Almanac, Verse Daily, and the Best Horror of the Year. She holds a BS in Biology and an MA in English from the University of Cincinnati, an MFA from Pacific University. Her poetry has appeared in journals like the American Poetry Review, Plowshares, and Poetry. Her personal essays have appeared on Salon.com and The Rumpus. Her website is www.webbish6.com. And you can follow Jeannine on Twitter and Instagram at Webbish6. Welcome to the Writer's Digest Presents, Jeannine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Today we're going to be discussing world building and poetry, but I wondered if you could just go ahead and start us off by reading the title poem from your collection, Becoming the Villainess.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Becoming the Villainess. A girl, love-locked, alone, wanders into a forest where lions and wolves lie in wait. The girl feeds them caramels from the pockets of her paper dress. They follow like dogs. Each day she weaves for 12 brothers, 12 golden shirts, 12 pairs of slippers, 12 sets of golden mail. She sleeps under olive trees, praying for rescue. In her dreams, doves fly in circles, crying out her name. For 100 years she was turned into a golden bird, hung in a cage in a witch's castle. Her brothers are all turned to stone. She cannot save them, no matter how many witches she burns. She weeps tears that cannot be heard but turn to rubies when they hit the ground. She lifted her hand against the light and it became a feathered wing. She learns the songs of mockingbirds, parakeets, pheasants. She wanders into the forest more herself. She speaks of her 12 stone brothers. There's a dragon curled around eggs. There's a princess who is also a white cat and a tiny dog she carries in a walnut shell. She befriends a reindeer who speaks wisdom. They are all in her corner. It seems unlikely now she will ever return home. Remember what it was like, her mother and father, the promises. She will adopt a new costume, set up shop in the witch's castle, perhaps lure young princes and princesses to herself to cure what ails her, her loneliness, her grandeur, the way her heart has become a stone.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Like when we first were talking among ourselves and planning out this episode on the editorial side, I thought, we talk about world building so much in fiction, sometimes even in nonfiction, but we don't often talk about it in poetry. And once I started thinking about it with poetry, you were the first poet that I thought about for this. But I wonder, do you think about world building when you go into your poems, or does it just kind of happen that way?
I think when I talk to younger people, when I do like workshops for young people, I always say that it's a good idea to use fiction writers' tool sets, even though we're not fiction writers. So things like dialogue, characters. It's why I have so many poems in persona, is because you're allowed to create characters and you can have them do what you want, and you can have entire poems in dialogue like a play if you want. So yeah, I think I've thought of it that way from the beginning, like almost like each book is its own world and you are building poems into that world. So when I write a book, it's usually people call them project-based books, but mine are really little worlds, right? And there are other poets who do this too. I was thinking of a couple off the top of my head, or Leanne Roripo has one called Tsunami versus the Fukushima 50, where she has a fictional character called Tsunami that speaks back to Japan after the Japanese nuclear disaster and tsunami. Banana Palace, in which Dana Levin imagines a apocalyptic world with a game show for people who eat because nobody eats anymore. Or even Mattia Harvey, this was a few years ago, but wrote a book called Modern Life that had robots who were surrogate children, and everything was war all the time. There's a lot of war in the book, and I was like, oh, those people, they're creating a world within their
Mm-hmm.
books. They're not just writing poems that like maybe go together. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? So,
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of times, like I'll write poems and think about them as like their own thing, and then try to like kind of tie them together later. But uh, so when you're coming at it, are you thinking more like you've got this world and you're writing these different poems within the world, or within like kind of the same like kind of sensibility, or?
I usually get stuck on a subject.
Mm-hmm.
With Becoming the Villainess, it was comic books, mythology, and fairy tales. And so I had this balloon. Here's this balloon. I fill it with poems. And then how do I make that into a logical book sequence, right? Like, what's the arc of that book? Who are the characters in it? How do you fill in gaps if you have gaps in the story? Um, Robot Scientist Daughter was sort of like that too. That was an autobiographical book, but I took the world there was Oak Ridge, Tennessee, right where I grew up, and I thought, how can I make that? How can I expand that world, that universe, from just me and my father who worked at Oak Ridge, into like now we have a robot scientist daughter who turns into a robot, goes into space, and so again, it's a balloon that fills with possibilities, right? So you can kind of, and Field Guide to the End of the World started with the title poem, which I thought, oh, what if we had a field guide? What if we had a, because I was a biology major, that was my first degree. We had field guides to birds, field guides to plants. What if we had a field guide to the end of the world, an instruction manual? And so I started writing. I wrote one in the voice of Martha Stewart. One's a letter to Ina Garten in the Hamptons, surviving the apocalypse. So it was just sort of the idea of how do we navigate the end of the world, which turned out to be more prescient than I wanted it to be. I was like, oh, I wrote about like a plague in here, but I didn't mean for it to happen. I'm really sorry if I did that. I apologize to you. It's like, I spoke it into being. Now it's there. I better write a really happy book next time. Next time, really happy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting though too, because like I do a lot of prompting of poems on the Writer's Digest site, uh, but this sounds like in a way like if you have like this concept to start from, in a way it's like kind of a way to generate your own prompts, because
Right.
you've got like this idea of where you're coming from.
And just like with fiction, fiction writers don't come at their books all the time with all the characters fleshed out, right? So maybe a
Mm-hmm.
character pops up you weren't anticipating, or you allow changes to the arc of the book because that's what that book seems to call for. So it is in a way it is like writing fiction. You set yourself up a world, and then you say, okay, and maybe I write 150 poems inside that world, and then like 70 of them make it into the book. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so it is kind of a great prompt to think, okay, if I was going to create this fictional world for this book, what would I create? Would it be terrible? Would it be fantastic? Would it be in space? Would it have
Mm-hmm.
robots? These are questions we should be asking ourselves.
Yeah,
Dinosaurs.
yeah, and I imagine like, and like I don't know, but I imagine that might make it easier when you get to that process where you feel like you have enough publishable poems for a collection to actually bring it together. Like as opposed to like my process when I'm writing like just one-off poems on a range of subjects. Sometimes when I go to like put them together, they might have been published, you know, in great journals, but like when you actually go to put them together, you're like, these pieces don't fit
Fit, right?
together.
Well, it's a big thing in manuscript organization. I almost think of it like a plot. And some novelists write outlines for their books and some don't, right? That's like a
Mm.
famous thing. But like you can almost write an outline for a poetry book. And so for Becoming the Villainess, I had this huge, massive poems. And my husband was like, what about putting it in the arc of a comic book?
Mm.
And I was like, oh, that makes sense, right? And so then I rearranged everything and shuffled it all and said, okay, this is how do comic book origin stories start, right? Innocent person bitten by a radioactive spider, comes a superhero, then gets corrupted and becomes a bad guy. That's the arc, right? So
Hmm.
using that arc does help you kind of rearrange things in a way that would make sense. It's
Yeah.
harder to do that with real life, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, things don't
Um,
always fit in the right order when they're happening in real life.
yeah. So that's like interesting for like world building, like on a big scale. Like getting down into like the specific poems. Like, are there things that you like elements that you try to like incorporate, like to build your world? Because like I know, like getting ready for this episode, I started looking through different poems and was actually like kind of surprised, like some of the poems where like I feel like there might be some, well, if I say like there's good world building, then there's good world building for me, anyways. But like when you're coming into a poem, like what types of elements, I guess,
Yeah.
on a poem by poem scale are you looking at?
So sometimes I focus a lot on scene. Sometimes I'm focusing on mood. Sometimes I'm focusing on characters. Like I said, sometimes I just write dialogue poems where characters are interacting with each other. In Field Guide, I wrote a series. This was kind of the idea that started that book. This series of postcards that this wandering survivor of the apocalypse is writing, but she's writing them to nobody. There's no mail service. There's nobody. She doesn't find anybody. She travels all over the place. She doesn't find anybody, but she's leaving postcards at all these different locations, the Viceroy Hotel in LA and unnamed island in the Pacific Northwest. She's just searching for people and doesn't find anybody. But the idea of these ghost postcards that just would be like an artifact after an apocalypse was really intriguing to me, and how a woman like me would face the apocalypse if there were no other people around. Then what would you do, and how do you set up that world to make it believable? Because I wanted those poems to be believable in the current day as well, right? Like I wanted them to work as
Mm-hmm.
poems. I wanted them to work in the current day, but I also wanted them to work kind of in the I am legend sense. What do we do when the world is empty? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and did you know Mary Shelley wrote the first apocalypse novel, the dystopia where everybody's dead? She wrote a plague novel. I read it at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was like, "What? What?" First of all, like nobody tells us that Mary Shelley wrote more than one book. And then when you
Mm-hmm.
do, and it's this really super, it's like almost a Victorian book of manners, which is not what you expect from an isolated apocalypse book. Anyway, if you ever get a chance, I
Right.
think it's out of print or something, but you can find it on Amazon, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think I had read about that. I have not actually read it though.
Yeah, it's a
My
very
wife's a
different
huge Mary
Mary
Shelley
Shelley
fan
fan.
though,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, it's just a completely Victorian approach to the apocalypse, which, I wouldn't be as Victorian, because I didn't grow up in that time period. But her approach is like very, she has, I mean, the whole time she's dealing with this apocalypse, her main characters always have manners and, graceful speech, and, they're not stabbing each other, so it's very much of her
yeah.
time.
Yeah, yeah. That's always it's interesting how different cultures would face the apocalypse.
Yeah. Well, we've
So,
been thinking about it a long time, and we're not the
yeah,
first generation to think about it,
right.
right? Remember all that apocalypse stuff in the 70s when we were, I assume you and I are close to the same age. When we were kids in the 70s, every children's book was literally about surviving the end of the world or being left
Hmm.
on an island or being left in a mountain or your parents die and you're left in some place and you have to survive this. That is what we grew up with. So,
Right.
we're equipped. We were equipped for this pandemic.
Yeah, yeah,
We were like,
yeah.
yeah, we better keep some dry cereal around just in case, some canned food, some extra
Yeah,
penicillin, you know.
yeah, yeah. I think everything that's happened in the past couple of years is it's been very triggering for bringing me back to my
Yeah,
childhood
that's it
and
for
the
for
things
me
that I
too.
worried about and I'd quit worrying about,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
and it all comes back.
I was remember my grandmother sent me this series of books called. Have you ever heard of the Foxfire books?
I've heard of them. I have not read them.
So there's a poem referencing it in Field Guide to the End of the World because that was a book my grandmother sent me when I was a child, and it's like how to survive, how to skin a pig and prep it for eating. Which at 7 probably wasn't going to put that into practice, but like how to plant peas so that they survive in different weather types, how to make your own dressing for a wound. Like it's just a very interesting book to own as a child.
Right.
Because in case you need it, there's the Foxfire books, and people talk about preppers. That's not a new idea. People have been prepping for a long time. That's not a.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, now the billionaires are into it, like building bunkers in New Zealand and whatnot. But they weren't the first. They, I don't think they
Yeah,
were even the
and
first generation to do that.
yeah, and it's very interesting when you give it to a child as well, because like I know for myself the amount of uh, exposure I had to people like falling into quicksand and stuff. Like
Quicksand.
I start to build like this worldview that as I get older, I'm going to have to worry about quicksand
It's always
like
quicksand
on
filled
a
with
daily
alligators.
basis.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
quicksand with alligators. I don't think those two things exist in the same place, but for some reason that was. And then remember all the nuclear war stuff, Day After Tomorrow,
Hmm.
like children's books about nuclear war and how that Hiroshima was a big subject in like my third grade library for some reason. I'm like,
Hmm.
wow, that's dark for an 8-year-old. You know,
I know. Yeah. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
that
I
really
know.
the right
Well.
thing to be giving us? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
oh well. At least it. Now with all this, we actually do have the threat of nuclear war. For us, it's not the first time we've worried about it, and it isn't for people who survived the '60s too. Those guys went through the
Hmm.
Bay of Pigs invasion where there actually could have been,
Hmm.
you know, nuclear war, and there wasn't. But
Yeah.
it's not anyway. It's not the first. This is not our first rodeo with this fear. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And yeah, but it's also like kind of bringing it back to world building though. It shows how if you do build it around, like I liked how you talked about, it might be an image or a setting, but you also had mentioned like I'm not sure if you used the word emotions, but
Mood.
something
Yeah.
to that effect, mood.
Yeah.
Yeah, and uh, I believe strongly like mood can be a major element of
Yeah, of
world
course,
building.
of course. And there sometimes you just write a poem that's a mood poem. You don't know where it goes,
Hmm.
but like at some
Hmm.
point it will fit in somewhere.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Um, all right. Well, we've been talking about world building in poetry, but you also, before I let you go, I want to mention that you had your book on PR for poets,
Yeah.
and I kind of want to like, well, it's a good way to use the book. Let's see. Um, I kind of want to go from world building and poetry to like how do poets get their poetry out into the world and in front
Yeah.
of people. And since you've written the book on it, I wonder if there's like one piece of advice that's like kind of your favorite piece of advice from that book.
Yeah, I think maybe, I mean, the book is full of tips and it has a calendar in it. It has lots and lots of things. And I'll probably have to write a new version of it at some point because I didn't even know about Instagram when I wrote that. I was like, there's Instagram? I don't know. That was sort of I hand waved at it. But now, Bookstagram's a big thing. Book TikTok is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy. So all I would say is to play to your strengths for one. Can I give you two? Because I actually have two.
Oh
Okay,
yeah,
so
definitely.
one is play to your strengths. If you're not a big, so if you're an introvert, a lot of writers are. There's a lot of stuff you can do to publicize your book without even going out of the house, right? Like you can write postcards, get a list of your friends, maybe like your Christmas card list, your holiday card list, send them postcards with the cover of the book and information on where to get it, maybe a personal message to your friends, because your friends and family are definitely going to want to hear about your book. Your alumni association wants to hear about this stuff, right? So do that first. You don't have to go out and say hi. You just have to say hi in a postcard. Easy, right? Or like in social media. If you hate social media, don't kill yourself doing social media. But if you like it, if you're good, if you're one of those persons that if you want, I'm not saying just millennials, but millennials, they tweet a lot, right? Like 8 times a day. So if you're a millennial, go with it, right? Do your tweets, and people aren't going to get bored of that. So whatever you're good at, kind of play to your strengths. The other thing would, and if you're a great in-person reader, do that by all means. But I'm like, not everybody can go travel the world reading in bars and coffee shops across America, right? So, if you're not good at that, don't freak out because I don't even think that's the main way people sell books anymore. Especially with the pandemic.
Hmm.
The other thing is prepare and and don't assume that the publisher is going to do everything. And I'm getting a bigger publisher for this next book, but most of my publishers have been pretty small. I think that's more more normal than not. So if you have a small publisher, one or two people running the show, you can't expect them to go out and like paper the world, buy a New York Times ad, put your stuff in magazines. It's probably not going to happen. So just be prepared to do some of the groundwork yourself. Yeah, and that's what the book talks about. It doesn't, you don't have to be a superhero of publicity. You don't have to be a charming, charismatic person. You don't have to know everything about marketing. You just have to find one or two things you are good at and do those things ahead of time.
Yeah, those are both great pieces of advice, and I think a lot of times it's easy to get overwhelmed thinking that you have to do everything that
Everything.
everyone else
Right,
does.
right. But everybody else isn't good at the same things you are, right? So
Right.
they have their strengths. I'm not going to do a bus tour of America. That's not going to happen. I'm handicapped. It's not super fun. So, I'm going to figure out a different way. And that's how everybody is. We all have our things that we want to do and don't want to do. If I love AWP and you hate it, you know, stay home. I'll go to AWP and have a great time. But that's okay. It's okay for us to do two different things with our books. I think.
Definitely.
I hope that's true.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It definitely. Yeah. It
Publishers
definitely
at
is.
publishers at home saying, "Oh my God, no, tell them to go to EWP. They have to.
Tell them to do everything.
They have to go on the bus tour. They have to do. Everybody has to do.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
No. Uh, Great. Well, if you're game, I'd love to hear one more of your poems.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll read this one. This is kind of one of the intro poems that I wrote to Field Guide, even before I'd really put together this book. It was sort of a preamble. And my mother, interesting fact, was like the head of disaster preparedness for Cincinnati Bell at some point. So this is where I got this. And she said something to me when I think I was in college. She was like, you can't really prepare for this. You're never really prepared for the disaster. You can do all this stuff. You can have these guidelines, but when it happens, everything's sort of nuts. So it goes to chaos. Anyway, so this is called Introduction to Disaster Preparedness. While you told me about the bee colony collapse caused by cell phones or maybe Monsanto, I was thinking about a friend who said they found a lump, and another friend finishing chemo and waiting for a scan, and a third who said my hair is a disaster and she meant the layers would take forever to grow out. My house is a disaster, she says, my yard, my outfit. When you told me my son is autistic, I thought of his bright eyes and beautiful tears. It's not the life you planned, how our minds and bodies spin apart like hives of bees confused about who to follow, flying further and farther out to discover what? That they'd flown too far and now are frozen, flightless. How many hives abandoned? We cannot sleep too far from disaster zones. I saw a tornado once in my own front yard, slept through hurricanes, knelt during earthquakes. Did I pray? Did I ask for something then? I only held my breath. When later asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "Everything is temporary." Cheerful.
Well, thank you so much. That's Introduction to Disaster Preparedness from Jeannine Hall Gailey's Field Guide to the End of the World. Thank you so much, Jeannine.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Remember that you can learn more about Jeannine Hall Gailey, her poetry, and her nonfiction guide, PR for Poets, at www.webbish6.com. And you can find her on Twitter and Instagram at Webbish6.